we've got quite an eminent and large panel to give you some feedback on this issue, and I'm going to introduce them. And then I'll ask each of them a question and then throw it open to the panel. The first one is Megan Anderson, the First Assistant Secretary of the NGO and Volunteers branch in DFAT. Megan has 18 years experience in public policy and complex program development and delivery, including volunteer programs and humanitarian response, as well as high-profile international development programs in infrastructure, health and education. Megan, then joined by Rosie Ween from Water Aid. Rosie serves on the board of the 3 Foundation, is a founder and committee member of the newly formed Not in My Workplace, a group of executive leaders working to address workplace harassment and abuse across all industries in Victoria. Next, we have Peter Baynard-Smith on the other side, the right-hand side of Megan. Most recently, CEO of Engineers Without Borders, and now leading the development of an innovative blockchain-enabled duty of care platform to assist organisations to continuously undertake verifications and maintain a permanent record of verifications on the blockchain. So, a technological solution. Also welcome Fiona Williams to Peter's right. Fiona is an independent specialist consulting in child safeguarding across Asia and the Pacific. She recently delivered a workshop for the Council for International Development in New Zealand on safeguarding and the prevention of sexual misconduct for member organisations. And finally, to my immediate right, the Country Director for ActionAid Afghanistan, Asuntha Charles. Asuntha is the previous country director for Oxfam Novib in Afghanistan and Bangladesh, also led the Joannata in the Philippines and the Intersos in Iraq. So a really eminent panel.
So WaterAid undertook this external review, and that was done by the Humanitarian Action Group HAG, and Beth Eggleston, one of the directors, is here today, and also Bongo HR. And what we asked them to do was to give us their perspective, to review our policy and practice, to review our culture, and to give us recommendations of what we could do better. So they looked at some 90 documents, did a survey of all WaterAid Australia staff across the region, so that's 100 people. We had quite a higher response rate of nearly 60%. And then they did key informant interviews, they tested their findings and then made recommendations to us. So we've revamped our code of conduct to really strengthen some of the areas around sexual exploitation and abuse. And it's going to sound really basic. We need to translate those into the languages of our staff so that they can understand them, but also ensure, as you were touching on and Sarah was touching on from the UK conference, to really make sure there's deep ownership and conversation about those with our staff in country and our partners. So we have amended our code of conduct and looking at developing policies, but where we're really putting our emphasis is on talking about what those mean. So what HAG and HR Bongo helped us do as part of the report was develop some scenarios. And we asked them to develop some scenarios that were going to really challenge us and challenge our teams to have conversations about the grey areas. Conversations where, can you tell if it's performance management or bullying? Questions about, is it sexual harassment or a consensual relationship? Is it a relationship based on unequal power? How do you raise that with your manager? And those scenarios are what we're using to then roll out our code of conduct so that we can have these conversations and to be thinking about what we need to be doing. We're also addressing the recommendations. There were 20 recommendations that help us think about recruitment and induction. What they found was that whatever we did for child safeguarding and fraud, we need to do for prevention of sexual exploitation and abuse and safeguarding issues more broadly, because everyone that they spoke to referred to our Child Safeguarding Code of Conduct, referred to our fraud policies and practices. So we know we've got that good foundation, and we need to replicate what we did for those, which is very much about keeping those conversations alive. So that's a bit of a summary of the external review that we had and some of the lessons that we learnt, and happy to build.
We're looking across all of the work we do with NGOs within the UN system and with our managing contractors and other delivery partners. But fundamentally, that's what we're getting at. You know, if we are unable to deal with this situation and close the loops where they may be, then the effectiveness of our work is diminished. The effectiveness of people's ability, if it's people inside the sector who are victims or survivors of abuse, but also people external. So from DFAT's perspective, in practical actions, the former Prime Minister joined the UN Circle of Leadership. Work within the UN where we're providing funding, support, engaging on a whole range of aspects of the UN's reforms, not just on peacekeeping but across the board, on codes of conduct, on responsible practice, on ensuring that victims and survivors are supported. In addition, people are aware that we've been working quite closely, I think, with the Australian Council for International Development and supporting through co-funding the review that you mentioned with the Victorian VIFM, Victorian Institute for Forensic Medicine. And also within the organisation, Tony and her team have led a broad review of our practices. So as I say, looking at what we do, and what we found is we do have quite strong measures on child protection. We've got 10 years of rolling that out. We understand this is not a once-off, one-off. We understand it requires deep and consistent investment, both within our organisation but also in rolling out and talking to others. We understand, of course, the challenges of what that means for downstream partners and how we continue to look at those issues. And we understand that it's a cultural change issue as well. So in addition to the UN work, we've reached out supporting ACFID. We have strengthened and tightened our accreditation criteria for Australian NGOs. One of the critical things there that I think that we've focused on is looking at a lot of our safeguards and how they apply to projects, which we've done very well for many years, and now thinking about where does that link come from projects to kind of the enterprise level issues. What's the link between the information that comes up through projects or whistleblowers or elsewise and how organisations change? Who gets that information at what level? Who's responsible for acting? So that is something that's an active conversation with the sector, and it's been a very positive and constructive conversation. In addition, we have released to our staff kind of reporting guidelines. How do they report? Ensuring that we've got whistleblowing kind of functions, made sure our posts and others overseas are aware of those as well. We have been part of the donor group you mentioned. I guess I would say that several donors are at the beginning of a journey that we commenced with the child protection space over 10 years ago. So we've got some good systems we can build on. We do see that there's space that we can improve, particularly around adults, adult reporting and the interaction between reporting and response. And I guess we're conscious as well that this movement, this process, these discussions really come from victims and survivors having the courage to speak up. So from our perspective, we're really conscious of making sure that we are respectful and understanding of that voice, and hopefully trying to roll out policies and procedures that respect that as well.
A number of issues very concrete issues that the Royal Commission highlighted in these systemic weaknesses include the following. The first is we have a very fragmented system. We need a consistent system. We are obviously a country with 3 levels of government, and we have state-based jurisdictions for our safeguarding systems. So working with children's checks, whether that's the Queensland Blue Card version or the Tasmanian Working with Children's check or the New South Wales Kids Guardian check, it's entirely fragmented. So one of the recommendations was that there needs to be more consistency and standardisation. However, COAG has pushed back on that, and essentially it's pretty much not going to happen, driven from government. The second is that as a result of this fragmentation, there are really significant cracks in the system that essentially expose vulnerable people, and in this case vulnerable children, to heightened risk. That's cracks between organisations, between jurisdictions, across sectors. The report talks about this notion of forum shopping, where perpetrators are able to work in locations perhaps where they've identified there's less rigorous checking. It's a very broken system. The other thing that the Royal Commission has done out of these findings is it's recognised that there's a really onerous burden on organisations in terms of compliance. There's a lot to do in terms of being compliant, but it's also flagging that that's resulting very often in very little real value. A lot of those compliance obligations are very passive. They are point in time. Unbelievably, when in Victoria, and I know this 'cause it's where I live, when you get your Working with Children's check, you also get a letter, and it tells you if you're charged with an offence or if such and such happens, whatever, it is your responsibility to, hand in your card. It's your responsibility to tell your employer that you've been charged with this offence. So it's clearly it's an onerous burden on organisations at the same time as actually not being very effective. It's also unduly complicated across all these different systems. Another recommendation from it, or another, implication from the recommendations, is that it reverses the burden of proof. So the burden of proof now is on organisations to prove that they did everything to prevent abuse. They did everything to prevent abuse. Not just that they responded appropriately when something happened, but the onus of proof is reversed. So organisations domestically are carrying much, much greater governance risk as a result of some of these changes. It also flagged or pointed to an issue of incredibly poor, very often manual record-keeping systems across the domestic child welfare and across many sectors that impacts on children. And when you have poor record-keeping, you have a system vulnerable to cover-ups, vulnerable to tampering, vulnerable to data loss. So essentially, a lot of systemic issues have come to light.
We know that sexual exploitation and abuse is around an abuse of power. When we're looking at children and the child rights issue, we're looking at people who go in and work in beneficiary communities, either in an emergency humanitarian response or in development work. We have staff, either local staff or international staff and volunteers, who are in positions of trust and authority. Now, we know that most of the time people uphold the values of organisations, but there is always that risk that that position of trust and authority can be used and exploited, if you like, in order to harm a child. So when we're looking at this area of safeguarding, there are specific risks for children and young people in this area that I think, whether we're child-focused or non-child-focused organisations, we need to be very aware of. And some of those particular risks would be around the fact that children are often separated from parents and carers during disasters, emergency responses. So we have unaccompanied children, we have child-headed households, So this raises the level of risk. These children are highly vulnerable in those situations to exploitation and abuse. Often children aren't registered or identified. We also have children and families in positions where there's a lack of food, a lack of shelter, medical supplies, and again, this increases the risks for children to be exploited in exchange for goods and services, food, medical provisions. Unfortunately, as we talked about, those positions of holding that, being the gatekeepers, if you like, of services, provisions, food, unfortunately there is that risk that can be exploited in exchange for goods, and often that's through sexual exploitation and abuse. Other issues that certainly pertain to children and young people in these situations is when we look at the engagement of sex workers by aid staff, again either local or international staff. Now again, we may want to look at this area in more detail, but when again, if we're looking at that culture that facilitated or allowed or ignored engagement of sex workers by staff, by aid workers, potentially, of course, many of those what we call sex workers or sexual exploitation of men and women, many of those people would be under the age of 18. Even if they're saying, oh, I am over 18, we know that there is a huge risk that a lot of those young people would be under the age of 18 years.
Good afternoon. I'm happy to be here and sharing my thoughts with you, very specifically to Afghanistan context, because as you know, it's when you say Afghanistan, it is the most unsafest place for women. So it's on the security side or on the sexual abuse. So looking at because I just take your word on the voices, because voices of women are silenced in Afghanistan. So when you say about having your policies, frameworks, and different procedures, structures within the organization, how much does it fit into the context? If women are able to speak out, however procedures and frameworks we have within ourselves, it's not going to be helpful. Because when we were trying to look at this issue, that's where we realized that because Afghanistan practices the Sharia law, which thinks women are inferior, so women are weak, you can do anything with women. So even if there is a sexual abuse happening, women cannot report because it is actually, it turns against them. And in no case in Afghanistan, it was first time last year that a man was sentenced for 20 years of imprisonment. It was the first time after the rape. So when women can share about any sexual abuse, she's being punished. So we have roughly 150 cases every year of honor killings, and especially about the sexual abuse. If women can share about it in the families or in the workplace, then it can be considered as a real women lose respect in the family, and the families think they cannot be treated as their own anymore. So a lot of honor killing happens when women start sharing about all the sexual abuses. Even in a workplace, there is a threat because women are only getting education and employment in the recent years after the Taliban period. So very few women are employed. So what happens if they express this kind of sexual abuse happening in a workplace? It's not only they lose the work, but they are totally kept inside the house. They are restricted of all the movements. They cannot go anywhere. Even today, some of the women go to the work accompanied by a male. So it is that situation that we are facing in Afghanistan. So my question is how, without hearing the voices of the survivors, voices of the victims, how can we come to a solution? So that's going to be practically very difficult in a situation like Afghanistan. And I was talking to our own staff. And if you see our own male staff, they have been taught the Quran and Sharia law starting from the age of 4 and 5. So those thoughts go into them very deep. So suddenly when they enter a NGO circle, all these international thoughts and ideas, it doesn't go into them so deep. Maybe for a project's sake, they are very gender sensitive. They can speak about women's rights. They can speak about sexual abuse and all these factors. But as persons, they are still following their own religious and cultural values. So ultimately, we realize working with communities is so very important on sexual abuse, because communities play a very important role. And we have also started working with mullahs, because the local mullahs are a strong factor in Afghanistan, because they start teaching children at the age of 4. So they teach what the Quran says. So maybe it's falsely interpreted. There is a lot of misinterpretation of the Quran, which most mullahs accept. So we want to work with those traditional leaders to see whether this can really start from the children, so that we don't really work when they grow as adults, which is not practical. So they work for an organization maybe 2 to 3 years, they jump into another organization. So these changes really don't take place. So we have to really start working with family members, start with working with community leaders, communities, and with influential religious leaders to bring about a change. So as an organization, though ActionAid has a zero tolerance for sexual abuse, but we still believe there are other factors we need to also include. We need to think about. Apart from having our procedures, having our staff recruitments, we also made sure that a female staff sits on the interview panel, so that we try to understand the attitudes of candidates. But with all this, there is a lot of other factors that need to come in, which can really able to understand the voice of the victims on the ground. And especially one more problem that maybe many are aware of, and it's not as become a very international highlight, is the dancing boys, which is a big problem in Afghanistan. So that's again like young boys of 8 years become a companion for an older man when they cannot really get female companion who can accompany them everywhere. Then they ultimately take the dancing boys with them. So this is again a discrimination that how do we sort it out? This is a sexual abuse, because they can be used for sex after certain years, because they are with them always, and they ultimately lose their childhood. At the end they become prostitutes, nothing else. So these are different factors which also need to be looked into when we really speak about all this sexual abuse and how do we overcome them. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think that's really helpful to have an in-country perspective. Look, we could, of course, keep going at length here, but I think it would be great to open to the floor now, because I'm sure there are a lot of questions that people would have.
I guess I wanted to share a little bit about a really big cultural change process we're going through within the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, which relates to this but is part of a broader exercise around bullying, harassment, diversity, inclusion, both from the perspective of safety, of our staff, how they feel, how effective they are at work, and obviously beneficiaries or people we interact with, but also from a fundamental position that if we don't have different voices and different views informing what we do right at the beginning, then actually we're kind of making up processes, policies, procedures that may or may not fit the context they work. And we heard from the guest speaker last night a little bit about that. What really struck me in her conversations, was a question that I asked around diversity within our own government system, and are we equipped to be able to respond to the different cultural practices even in our own country. So we've been having quite a big agenda for a couple of years now within the department. around women in leadership, but broader than that goes to a lot of these questions, and absolutely goes to kind of policies and processes and procedures, but also goes to how does change happen. And I guess the kinds of things we've experimented with, and like many of the organisations here, we are a global organisation. We have posts in some many hundred countries across the world, and we work in different contexts, both quite intense contexts, humanitarian, etc., but also a range of countries where this is also an issue. It's not any one issue for one area, it's different in different places. But certainly what we found is everybody in a senior level, getting back to leadership, has undertaken unconscious bias training. Which kind of goes to your question. We all try our best, we all think we're doing a good job, but recognising in yourself where you might have those blinkers or where you're not necessarily open to other perspectives has been an important part of engendering that leadership change across the whole organisation. So it's just one person's idea or one policy area's idea. We've really invested in data. So every 6 months to the entire organisation, everyone in the entire international network gets data at the beginning of the process, which was quite confronting for all of us on a number of these fronts. And every 6 months additional data is released on how we're tracking against our recommendations, but also how that data is going. So people can track that at an individual level, and they can see is this just on paper or is this real change that is being embraced? There is quite a strong conversation that's going on. We've introduced some circles of leadership. So essentially making space, we work in a pretty hierarchical organisation, making space for conversations about these things where hierarchy is deliberately not part of that conversation. So ensuring that we have on a regular basis these circles where people can come together, share experience, theirs or others, and voice issues or opportunities in that conversation where hierarchy is out of the picture. It's kind of a safe space. Of course, we've got whistleblowing arrangements, and we have had for many years codes of conduct, but kind of doubling down on those and having a talk about those and having those talks in different cultural contexts along the way that Asunta and Rosie mentioned in terms of leadership and owning. In areas where we have found it's particularly tough, we have, at least in one case, kind of embedded a change person, a person who's responsibility, who's engaged, who's working with the leadership in that area to make the space available. One of the things we found in that process is that people find it difficult, in all contexts, including here, sometimes to call out everyday sexism or to call out issues that they see. We've also kind of introducing a range of ways to call things out, if you like, that might be different. It sounds a bit twee, but actually it's an interesting kind of cartoons, shows. When you say, I made sure that you got extra help before you did that panel session today because I really support the women in leadership agenda. What you're saying is, I really support you, but what I'm hearing is you wouldn't have given that support to a man because you think I'm only half good at this particular job. So kind of sharing that in a way that, because we work in an organisation where people are trying to make change, so that it's a safe place for everyone in the organisation to share their experiences, even when unintended consequences kind of come out of that process.
Just to share a bit on that, we have been also working on women leadership forums, which can actually help women to talk about their concerns in a place where they feel very safe. But at the same time, we feel men have to also play a role in it, because men need to really understand what are their problems, and sometimes men have their own problems to address too. So such platforms can also help people to come out of their problems. But honestly, I feel given the context of sexual abuse having a patriarchal background, it's very much, it has to be interlinked. It cannot be handled in isolation. So unless you address the patriarchy as an issue to be addressed, then addressing sexual abuse is going to be also very difficult.
I'll start. Thanks, Peter, and a really good question, because I think this is for the sector, this piece around accountability. And what our report told us is that our reporting system don't really encourage some of those just niggles or concerns that could help you identify a risk area early on. So our reporting said, if you've got a concern, report to the focal person or report to the CEO. So that's a really big leap for someone who's just got a bit of a niggle or a concern and they want to talk it through. So it really told us, yes, we need the centralised reporting system, because we know with these questions around power and abuse of power, it's never just one thing that's happening. There's likely to be fraud and all of these other things. So we need centralised reporting to show us the picture, but also we need to have multiple reporting mechanisms for that to happen. So we've really strengthened the safeguarding focal point system. We've strengthened the idea of having those conversations with your line manager, but also helping line managers. Well, what do you do when you have that conversation and concern? So that's some of the things that the report told us we needed to work on, and that we're continuing to work on, as has already been indicated, somewhat easier in our Melbourne office, but then how do we roll that out to the 27 countries that we're working in very different contexts? So again, I go back to my point that this isn't a moment in time conversation, but a sustained cultural shift that we need to be having as a sector and as an organisation. Going back to Asunta's very well made point, very much grounded in the context where we're working of not our staff, but also the partners with which we're working in. So some of the things that we're thinking about and working on now and into the future. Peter.
Thanks. Yeah, absolutely, around the accountability and reporting. I think we need to, if we're looking at safeguarding, we need to make it safe for people in our organisations to come forward and speak out. How do we do that? How do we create that culture of safety within our organisations? And I think it's really important to start with, what are the barriers that are preventing people from speaking out around some of these incredibly complex and sensitive issues. And as you mentioned, Peter, it may not be illegal behaviour as we know it, because in one way that's actually easier to call out. It's things that we're not sure. And often, you know, it may be behaviour that a person thinks, yeah, I'm just not, as you mentioned, I'm just not comfortable with this. Or maybe that is in our code of conduct, or you know, we need to be able to, our staff to be able to come and say, I just saw this the other day. Look, I might be wrong. It might be nothing. But as, you know, management or whoever those reports are going to, that's what you want to hear. You want to be able to go here, look, I haven't got much to go on, but I just saw this the other day. And then as management, as organisations, you can then take that and handle it appropriately and investigate professionally. But what are the barriers that are stopping people doing that? If we have a local staff member who is being sexually harassed by a staff member coming from Australia, what are the power dynamics there that are preventing her from speaking out about this? If we have children who are being taken back to residence of staff members, do people turn a blind eye because, you know what, I'm not a child protection expert, I don't know what's going on here, I might be wrong. So we need to be looking at saying, you don't need to come with facts and conclusive evidence, you're not expected to be experts in this area, but if you just have that feeling that this is not okay, that this could be placing a child or an adult at harm and a risk of sexual exploitation, abuse, you need to let us know. We will handle that appropriately, but we need to create a culture where people feel safe, and it's the right thing to do to come forward and speak out on these issues.
I understand it's a very long process, so it's not like it's going to happen the next day. Even when we, that's something that I always wonder, like when there are bigger issues, that happen in the West, then it becomes a big issue for the South. Like, no, it's like something, like nobody bothered, like Sri Lanka, so many women were abused during the war, and it never became a big issue for us. It should have been already an issue spoken widely, but nobody spoke about it. Like during tsunami, so many women were abused. Like, for me, the biggest problem is like when the issues become very big for us, whether when it happens in the West or it happens in the South. But coming to your point, like we are also very project specific people. We want to directly implement the projects and see that it is it has actually the outcome is achieved. That's what we do in many times. But sometimes these issues can be also addressed when we start implementing the projects. Like when we start conversing with the communities, that's a platform which we can use, which we can go beyond the projects to discuss about these higher issues that has an impact on the overall society. So I think gender issues something that we need to really integrate with all that we do. Like talking about the power issues, like how it is affecting, how it has a wider impact on the women. I think it needs to become an integrated component of all the projects that we do, whether it's a humanitarian one or a development one. That can become more powerful.
I do think to note that DFAT actually does make that a core criterion in the funding, and that's been very helpful from an Australian perspective.
For me, the core piece is around walking the talk. So as an organisational leader, so thinking of me as the leader of WaterAid, CEO, what does that mean in terms of walking the talk of what we've committed to in our policies and practices? And as Mark said the other day, is there a gap between what we say externally with the internal practices, and how am I held to account by our staff, our partners, the communities we serve to that? And then for me, something I still struggle with 2 years into having the CEO title is the use of power, and how do I do that in terms of being a leader, and how am I using that to bring about the changes that I want to see in the world, but also within the organisation that I serve.
Just to touch upon, as I highlighted, there's also a positive thing going on. Like I said, there's a person imprisoned for sexual abuse. So that's something that now legal side issues are progressing, maybe because of the pressure from the international community, which we see as a positive change. But on the whole, we need to create platforms for women to talk about things, because even talking about sex or anything, it is something that women feel very awkward about it in Afghanistan. So creating such platforms for women to talk about these issues. What is really sexual abuse? Like, because today we see that the street abuse is increasing in Afghanistan. People can touch you, people can do anything on the street, and nobody will bother. And nobody protests, and even the public don't stand by you. They think this is a normal thing, because when a woman goes out of the house, they think she's a very bad woman. So that is the connotation that they have. So if you're employed, if you're going to study, that means you're not an obedient woman according to the Islamic laws. So then you are, anybody can do anything to you and nobody will resist. So that's the attitude. So now we have to slowly work with men and women to see that this is not the right attitude. Maybe, and we have to also find legal assistance to these women. So we are running a lot of legal centers for women to understand what can be done legally. Though it will take a long time for people to change, because legally things are not going to change very fast in a country like Afghanistan, and we have less than 1% women representation in the security services and also in the legal services. So things will take a long time to go. But as organizations, we can promote safer space for women, at least to start sharing. Because many of the cases, like I was reading the Me Too website, like many cases highlighted happened 15 years ago, 17 years ago. So it doesn't have any meaning at this point of time. Like, no, how do you really validate your statement? So at least women to rise up and say this is not something that should be done. At least that voice needs to be heard. For that we have to really create platforms for women to talk about it, that this is not something that we agree with. So that men understand, okay, women are thinking that this is not a right attitude. So such kind of attitude that also needs to be promoted among women. So this is part of that work that we do as part of legal awareness for women.
Thank you. And look, we might confine ourselves to one response on the issue of leadership. Anyone want to? I'll make an introductory comment. There's actually very good reading in the independent inquiry into the Commonwealth Bank and the pervasive issues of culture and leadership and the impact on governance. And that tells you, that's of course in a business context, but I think it's transferable to other contexts. And so they're absolutely, it's informed by international practice and it's leadership that's making the difference. I think this panel, it's a very large panel, but then it's a very complex issue, and I do think we've been incredibly well served by the broad range of perspectives, and also by the involvement of you, the audience, because we've had some great questions and comments as well. So thank you very much, and it's over for a well-deserved lunch. Thank you.